Speak was the honourable member for Calgary Alberta.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll continue. Appreciate that. So, speaking about the government's motion too, am I upset with the BC government's repeated attempts to block the lawfully approved Kinder Morgan pipeline? Of course I am, Madam Speaker. I'm a proud Albertan, and I will always stand up for the best interest of my home province. And I can also tell you that my constituents are angry not only with the attempts of BC to block the lawful construction of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, but also about the failure of Energy East and of Northern Gateway and of all of the barriers, big and small, that have been put in the way of the development of Alberta's energy industry. I can tell you I've had many conversations with my constituents, most recently this Friday, constituency day in a coffee shop in my constituency, where it was made abundantly clear to me that my constituents are very upset with the repeated attempts to block lawful access for Alberta's natural resources to global markets. And it's especially frustrating when our neighbours to the south continue to grow their energy production and steal Alberta's market share, while supporting many of the protests that have stalled energy development in our province. Now, we all know about the story of growing energy production in Texas and North Dakota. The growth in shale oil has made the U.S. a net exporter of crude, but a constituent pointed me to the extent of urban drilling in one of the most densely populated locations in the United States. Do you want to guess where that is? Los Angeles, California. LA, over the past 125 years, has produced 9 billion barrels of oil, and still today pumps 12% of California's oil, with nearly 80,000 people working directly or indirectly in that industry. There's a refinery, the El Segundo refinery is the state's largest, processing 269,000 barrels of oil a day. The Wilmington oil field in LA has over 1,200 wells right on the coast of Long Beach. And there are many other producing wells all throughout greater Los Angeles, and some even in beautiful Beverly Hills. In 2015, a California government report showed that many grades of California crude have substantially higher carbon intensity than Alberta's oil sands crude, in some cases twice as much. And some blends of other countries' crude, Venezuela and Nigeria in particular, are 3 or even 4 times as carbon intense as Alberta's crude. And so why do I bring all of this up? Because compared to what happens in the United States in one of the most dense urban areas of the country where there's substantial oil production, for our neighbours in British Columbia to attempt to block a single pipeline which is a twinning of an existing pipeline, it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic and frustrating. It's frustrating to my constituents, Madam Speaker, and it has been incredibly frustrating to me. But what is just as frustrating is to witness the ham-fisted way that Alberta's NDP have made the case for pipelines. Yes, we know there is economic benefit from pipelines. Alberta, by a recent report, loses $7.2 billion a year as a result of lack of market access. The federal government loses a direct $800 million a year. Private investment is constrained by $5.3 billion a year. The overall cost to Canada's GDP from lack of market access is $15.6 billion a year. That is a substantial amount of money. So in addition to the economic benefit, we know that the science is rock solid, that pipelines are by far the safest way to transport Canada's products to market. This includes those double-hulled tankers that use not only the latest GPS technology, but also pilot ships to ensure they safely navigate the inner harbours on the way to open ocean. And by the way, in the 62 years that tankers have been transporting crude oil from the Vancouver port, there have been 0 incidents. That's 0 incidents of tankers spilling. Absolutely none in all of the years since 1956, where GPS wasn't even science fiction. But in addition to the safety and the economic benefits of pipelines, there is a strong environmental case to be made. This government has let our province down because they haven't told British Columbians that we share their desire to address climate change. Alberta and BC's interests are and should be aligned. British Columbians should know that Albertans share their desire to reduce carbon emissions, or at least some of us on this side of the House share their desire to reduce carbon emissions, which is exactly what the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion will do. How? Alberta innovators, including government, academia, industry, and more, are working to reduce carbon emissions from oil sands. The Clean Resource Innovation Network, which includes COSIA and many others, is finding ways to reduce and maybe even remove carbon from Alberta's oil sands from extraction to end use. How many people in BC know about the Carbon X Prize? It's a $20 million incentive to move new and emerging CO2 technologies from the lab to real-world demonstration. To translate, Alberta is leading the charge to a low-carbon future. And if we apply some of the economic gains realized from attracting global prices for a product that's still in demand, and we've heard repeatedly today, and we know that even with the emergence of electric vehicles, global energy and oil demand will continue to grow. We know that if we can attract global prices for that product, economists have said that there is a strong case to be made for investing in projects, investing the revenues that we will drive from the economic activity, the legitimate, safe, and legal economic activity of producing oil and gas in this province. If we invest some of that in reducing carbon emissions, we will have a tremendous environmental and tremendous economic benefit. These investments would not only reduce carbon emissions from hydrocarbon production and use, but would allow Alberta entrepreneurs to do what Alberta entrepreneurs do best, to create the companies and technologies to address a problem the world is grappling with, to attract capital to our province, to diversify our economy, to innovate and create those technologies that we can sell to the rest of the world. Now, the crude shipped through the Kinder Morgan expansion will also displace higher carbon crude produced in places like Venezuela and Nigeria. And I can promise you that neither of those countries' environmental or social standards are anywhere near Alberta's. And let me be absolutely clear. Alberta's energy industry is the most socially, environmentally responsible energy production in the entire world. Our regulator is second to none anywhere in the world. We export our regulatory expertise around the world. The world is trying to produce oil and gas in the same way that Alberta does, in the safe and socially responsible manner. And having worked in that industry, I can tell you, Madam Speaker, I have seen it firsthand. It is absolutely true. That is the story that we need to be telling our neighbours in British Columbia and telling the world. But in addition to making this case to British Columbians, we need to ensure that Ottawa steps up. Now, this is a project that has been approved after thorough vetting by one of, if not the, very best energy regulators in the world. The pipeline is safe, it is in the public interest, and it absolutely must be built. The federal government must step up and aggressively send that message to BC. And the Alberta government needs to step up and aggressively send that message to Ottawa. That Ottawa needs to invoke Section 9210C of the Constitution, that this is a project in the general interest of our country. And while it is okay, as this motion says, to urge the federal government to take action, and I will give this government credit for some, what I would call gentle nudging of Ottawa, they have pushed, but they haven't pushed nearly hard enough. The NDP needs to be very specific about what they want Ottawa to do. They should declare loudly that Ottawa should employ their powers under the Constitution to declare this Kinder Morgan pipeline a project in the general interest. And so in the end, the Alberta Party Caucus will likely support this motion. We look forward to seeing the amendments that come forward. We do think that there are some areas and opportunity for improvement. But it's not nearly good enough for the Premier to talk about just the fact that there is a carbon tax and an attempt to gain social license for building that pipeline. And it is not enough for this Premier or this government to simply make the economic case for pipelines. And it is not enough for this government simply to threaten another trade war. Alberta and BC's interests are much more closely aligned than we think. It is up to this government to make that case and to ensure that the Kinder Morgan pipeline is built. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any questions or comments under Standing Order 29-2A? Seeing none, I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise in support of this motion to support the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and to call on the federal government to live up to its responsibility to support the pipeline that it has approved. You know, Madam Speaker, I've spoken before in this Assembly about the personal deep roots I have with the energy sector. Many of my family members have worked and continue to work within the sector. And I've also bragged many times about where I live in Alberta, which is northwest Alberta, which is currently a growing centre for oil and gas activity. Many of my constituents in Dunvegan and Central Peace Notley work in the industry, as do neighbouring constituents. This is not a phenomenon confined to the Alberta side of the border either. A lot of folks on the BC side of the border also work in the sector. People in my area travel back and forth. It's something that's been going on for many, many years, and it's something that people mostly take for granted up my way. In northwest Alberta, we don't have differences with our neighbours on the BC side of the border. We share common economic interests and a common understanding of the value that the oil and gas sector brings to the well-being of our communities. So make no mistake, this is not a dispute between the people of Alberta and the people of BC. This is a disagreement between governments about the best way to develop our economy and protect our environment. Here in Alberta, we're protecting our environment and the future of our economy through an ambitious, nation-leading climate leadership plan. It's a plan that phases out coal-fired electricity by 2030. It's a plan that helps households, businesses, farms, communities, and not-for-profits reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their costs through new energy efficiency programming. It's a plan that already has made history for achieving the lowest prices for renewable-generated electricity. And it's a plan that has placed a hard cap on oil sands emissions. That plan helps secure the federal government approval for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and for Line 3. That plan is the reason why we have a pipeline approval to defend it all. And that plan is our answer to those who claim that Trans Mountain will increase greenhouse gas emissions. Simply put, Madam Speaker, it won't. Alberta now has a hard cap on emissions from the oil sands. We've given industry the time and room to innovate, to develop new technologies that will enable them to reduce their carbon footprint. But there is a cap in Alberta beyond which the oil sands emissions cannot exceed. So we know the Trans Mountain expansion won't increase greenhouse gas emissions. But what are the benefits? Why is our government so determined to get this pipeline built to Tidewater? The answer, Madam Speaker, is very simple. Our biggest market historically has been the U.S. For decades, Alberta has been able to sell its oil to our neighbours to the south and make a bit of a tidy profit. Today, however, the U.S. is not just our biggest customer, it is our biggest competitor. In recent years, U.S. oil production has skyrocketed, and Americans are now energy self-sufficient. The result? Alberta producers are now selling our resources at a discount. It is estimated through the course of 2018, the gap between the average U.S. price and the average Western Canadian price will average out more than $21 a barrel. Imagine the impact of that price differential on one Canadian energy company, particularly on players that have already been ravaged by the oil price shock of recent years. Imagine how much harder that lower oil price is making it for many operators to stay competitive, maintain production, and keep people working. Now imagine the impact of that across the entire industry and the damage that it is doing to our Canadian economy. It's certainly not small, Madam Speaker. Indeed, a recent study by Scotiabank, which has been referred to a couple times today, the cost alone in 2018 could be more than $10 billion. Madam Speaker, a loss of that magnitude will inevitably impact jobs and incomes for working families. A loss of that magnitude will make its impact felt in government revenues that support public services like health care, education, social programs, and environmental protections. The same study, Madam Speaker, suggests that the price differential may ease somewhat as more oil finds its way onto the rail system. But there are economic costs to that scenario as well, as oil competes with other products, such as agricultural products, on our rail system. And of course, there are safety concerns of transporting more oil by rail. Madam Speaker, no government that cared about working families as this government does could fail to act. And in the speech from the throne on Thursday, our government made it very clear just how far we will go to defend Alberta's right to get a fair price for our resources. As I've said, the single biggest threat to our competitiveness is the current lack of Canadian pipeline capacity to global markets. The Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project will go a long way to solving this problem, and our government has been clear from day one that we will do whatever it takes to get it built. When the Government of BC tried to overstep its constitutional authority and regulate something it has no right to regulate, our Premier and our government stepped up. We shut down talks on expanding electricity trade, banned BC wines from Alberta shelves, and brought together a task force, Madam Speaker, of experts and notable Canadians to provide us with the best advice. Those measures were effective in getting British Columbia to back away from the illegal point in their plan, and effective in making sure all Canadians knew our resolve. But in the face of continued threats, we need to be prepared to take further steps to protect our workers and protect our industry. And if that means invoking legislation similar to the bold action taken by Premier Peter Lougheed when our energy industry was under attack in the past, we will not hesitate. But let me be perfectly clear, Madam Speaker. Our government understands that taking such action, even if absolutely necessary, could have consequences for our energy sector. We sincerely hope it doesn't come to this. And make no mistake, our government has no desire to take this step. But it's important that BC and the country know we will do whatever it takes to make sure our constitutional rights are respected as partners in Confederation. If we are forced to take this step, we will not do it lightly, and we will do it with open lines of communication with all our energy stakeholders. Madam Speaker, one of the most gratifying parts of our work on Trans Mountain has been support we've received from Albertans from all walks of life. People like the members in the Market Access Task Force, who I want to thank for their incredible work. We're talking about people like Frank McKenna, Anne McClellan, Jim Carter, Peter Hogg, Peter Terzakian, Trevor Toome, Ginny Flood, and Janet Annesley. Every one of them is making an enormous contribution to Canada, and I want to thank them all for the work they have done. I also want to thank members of the Building Trades of Alberta for their presence here today, representing the thousands of working men and women who work every day in our sector, and in jobs that are hard and jobs that are demanding and crucial to the well-being of Alberta's economy and to the Canadian economy. And I want to note some of their words of support. A quote from Terry Parker, Executive Director of Building Trades. The Trans Mountain expansion is a project that would not only benefit many skilled trades workers, but also encourage additional investment in Alberta to the benefit of all of us. We support the work of the Alberta government standing up for the people of Canada. It's critical that all our provinces, oil citizens of Alberta or of Canada, recognize that for Canada to prosper, we must work together. End quote. There are many others, Madam Speaker, but I want to continue because I have some other good words to say. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Indigenous leaders who have been in attendance today, upon whose traditional territory this legislature meets. And I want to thank them as well for their participation in this fight and for their words of encouragement to me and my colleagues. You know, Madam Speaker, there's a tendency sometimes in debates for these for some people to speak on behalf of Indigenous people instead of respecting that they have their own diverse voices and can speak very well for themselves. So I want to provide a quote from Chief Ronald Kreutzer from Fort McMurray First Nation. Quote, "The Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline is essential to the viability of the economic engine of Canada, the Alberta oil sands, and First Nations. Fort McMurray 468 First Nation relies heavily on the responsible development of the oil sands to provide the necessary economics to be a self-sufficient nation for the next 7 generations, end quote. We have another quote from Chief Arthur Rain of the Paul First Nation, who wrote, quote, Kinder Morgan and its representatives have been engaging First Nation leaders in membership for several years. Through these years, we have worked hard to develop a relationship of deep trust and mutual benefit, end quote. Finally, Madam Speaker, I want to thank the many leaders from the energy industry with whom I work every day, and I've gotten to know over the past 3 years, many whom with my staff and I have spoken in recent days. You know, Madam Speaker, my government colleagues and I take very seriously the responsibility to this industry and the working women and men that this industry employs. We know the decisions that we take have direct bearing on their future and the ability of hundreds of thousands of Canadians to make ends meet. It has shaped our work implementing the Climate Leadership Plan, a plan which brought the approval, as I mentioned, of Kinder Morgan as well as Line 3. It has motivated our plan to provide leadership to support energy diversification in the form of partial upgrading of our bitumen, more petrochemical development, and better access to the natural gas liquids our industry needs to grow. Our goal, Madam Speaker, is to foster a more resilient economy and a recovery that is built to last. Finally, Madam Speaker, it has underpinned our determination to fight for better market access and to get our resources to new markets, to close the gap between the price we are forced to accept for our resources and the price we deserve. It is why we do not take lightly our decision to provide ourselves with all the tools we deem necessary to defend our industry and to defend our province's right to get a better price for our resources. We know that if we were to act precipitously, we run the risk of inflicting short-term pain on an industry and on a group of workers that have already suffered more than their fair share in the recent years. That is why I'm so gratified, Madam Speaker, by the many words of encouragement I have received from industry leaders in recent days. People have told me repeatedly that while they worry about the short-term consequences for themselves and their workers, we do need to step up and take this step if necessary. People like Mark Schultz from the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, who has stated publicly, quote, "We are very supportive of the Premier. She has shown some incredible leadership on this file," end quote. Mark is just one of the people showing his support and solidarity in the gallery here today. And we are joined by others, Ben Brunin from CAP, Elizabeth Aquin from PSAC, Bill Clapperton from CNRL, Julie Wu from Canadian Natural, Kerry Scobie from Imperial Oil, and Scott Wenger from Suncor. And there are others who have spoken on our behalf to the media or stand ready to do so if called upon today. Madam Speaker, I am gratified by the trust so many have put in us, trusting that we will not act precipitously, trusting that we will not take action simply to grandstand, but only when it is truly necessary, trusting that as we understand that our actions have real consequences for real people, that we must be measured, mature and responsible, as well as firm and decisive. Madam Speaker, it is an honour to be the beneficiary of that level of trust, and I know my colleagues and I strive to be worthy of it every day. Madam Speaker, Albertans from all walks of life are unified and united. Workers, community leaders, many Indigenous leaders, industry. They stand together in calling for fairness, in calling for respect for the rule of law and the constitutional authority of the federal government, in calling for Alberta's right to defend our workers, to defend our economy, and our right to get a better price for our energy. Madam Speaker, Albertans stand united. The members of this Assembly should also stand united as well. I urge my colleagues in the legislature to show that unity here today and to support this motion unanimously. Thank you.